But alright, well, thanks everybody for coming. Happy International Women's Day. We're the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So we just want to say thank you all for being here, and thank you to Beloved and Amy for letting us use this space. I'm Sarah, and this is Courtney. We're both in the party. So I just want to give a little background on what International Women's Day is about first before we get into the housing stuff. So it's basically an annual day of recognition and struggle for women's economic, social, and political rights. It's an opportunity for awakening consciousness among women workers and for building unity among the working class. And this is a little bit of history about it. It was first proposed by Clara Zetkin at the Socialist International in Copenhagen in 1910 in order to honor the movement for women's rights and build support for achieving universal suffrage for women. The proposal was greeted with unanimous approval by the conference of over 100 women from 17 countries. So Clara Zetkin understood the necessity for proletarian working class feminism as opposed to bourgeois feminism, which advocated mainly for reforms and still does advocate mainly for reforms. She understood the link between the oppression of women and class-based oppression, and that in order to fight the oppression of women, we must also fight against the economic exploitation of the working class by the bourgeoisie. And I'm just going to read a quote from her that I think is really good. So this is from Clara Zetkin herself. She says, "The working women who aspire to social equality expect nothing for their emancipation from the bourgeois women's movement, which allegedly fights for the rights of women. Working women are absolutely convinced that the question of emancipation is not an isolated question, but part of the great social question. They realize perfectly clear that this question can never be solved in contemporary society, but only after a complete social transformation." So what she's getting at with that quote is basically the fact that the oppression of women is exacerbated by capitalism and made worse by it due to lower wages and discrimination, but also the oppression of women directly helps capitalism reproduce itself and remain the dominant economic system. So historically, women have been expected to perform unpaid domestic labor in the home for the benefit of their husbands and families, and expected to even literally produce the next generation of workers who also need to be fed, clothed, and cleaned up after. Nowadays, most working women must do all of these tasks on top of working for a wage. Without the unpaid domestic and reproductive labor that women historically have performed, capitalists would not have a workforce to exploit. Basically, the cooking, the cleaning, the child rearing, all of that is essential tasks for workers to be able to continue living and reproduce their own existence so that they continue to work for capitalists. And that's exactly why the fight for women's liberation has to include also the fight against capitalism. And this is just, I love this graphic. It just illustrates perfectly what Clara Zetkin was basically talking about. So now I'm going to read this quote from Engels about housing to tie in how capitalism, I'm sorry, what? Oh, should I just, if it's just like near me, does that work? Do I have to hold it, do you think? Okay. So this quote, I think, just kind of demonstrates that, like, sort of the common thread between women's oppression and, like, the housing crisis is pretty much just capitalism. So Engels in The Housing Question says, "As long as the capitalist mode of production continues to exist, it is folly to hope for an isolated solution of the housing question or of any other social question affecting the fate of the workers. The solution lies in the abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the appropriation of all the means of life and labor by the working class itself." So to give a kind of local context to the housing crisis here, in Asheville in 2017, 52.3% of Buncombe County renters, over half of people renting in Buncombe County, which is 16,000 people, qualified as cost burdened, meaning they spend at least 1/3 or more of their income on housing. And this is a quote from Citizen Times. They say that while unemployment is historically low and the economy is humming along, evictions remain stubbornly high in Buncombe County, which had 2,088 eviction filings in 2017. So you hear the word like housing crisis a lot, but what that really comes down to is just a crisis of capitalism. Capitalism commodifies housing and functionally denies it to millions of people. There's approximately 18.4 million vacant homes, which is 11% of homes are vacant in this country, while there are 3.5 million Americans experiencing homelessness each year. There are 6-to-1 empty dwellings outnumber homeless people 6-to-1, which is mind-blowing to me. So literally thousands of Americans are freezing to death on the streets because they don't have a home, and banks are allowing 18.4 million homes to just sit unoccupied. Sometimes they'll even bulldoze them and give away the land to the state just for free. It's absurd. So the housing crisis, it's not due to a shortage of housing by any means. It's literally due to a crisis of overproduction. There's basically more housing stock that exists than can be sold at a profit. So the banks are basically hoarding it to maximize that profit. Because if they sell it right now, they won't make any money. And capitalism protects their right to do this. So they're allowed to just seize and control the homes of working class people. And under capitalism, these banks are under no obligation to distribute these life-saving resources to the people that need them. And then, of course, housing is a determining factor for employment and education. Housing determines social status, and social status determines housing. So it just creates this vicious cycle that's really hard to break out of. Like without a stable address, it's very hard to find work. Without work, it's almost impossible to pay rent. And then how do you even break out of that? And then, of course, homelessness and housing insecurity amplify existing disparities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Women and oppressed nationalities are at higher risk for home repossession and housing insecurity. The U.S. government housing policy favors wealthy homeowners, providing them with huge tax breaks while discriminating against the poor. So capitalism's inability to address housing needs derives from its essential principle of maximizing profits by commodifying every human need. And then we have landlords profiting off of this human need for shelter by increasing housing costs to maximize profits. Even the entire criminal justice system works to the benefit of landlords. Evictions often rely on police enforcement, and the courts almost always lean in favor of the landlord. Under capitalism, human needs like shelter are precariously dependent on the whims of the market. So much so that just a $100 increase in rent is associated with an increase in homelessness of 6 to 32%. And then I'm going to hand it off to Courtney. I want to switch spots. Are you good?
I'm good. So housing insecurity and homelessness are feminist issues. Housing inequities serve not only to exploit the entire working class for profit, but also to help control the social status of women. Working class women, especially women of color, are at the center of the housing struggle. Women are 35% more likely than men to be low-income workers. As we all know, like the statistic of like women make 85 cents for every dollar a man makes. So they make less money, they have less ability to pay for rent on their own.
And then it's even worse when they're like women of color or there's other like oppressed identities in there as well.
And because of these inequalities, many women are forced into economic dependency or live in poverty independently or become homeless. Next slide. The patriarchy with the material backing of capitalism restricts women's agency through economic coercion. Single mothers are 5 times more likely than paired parent families to be poverty-stricken, meaning a higher likelihood of displacement. Systemic sexual violence compounds housing insecurity. 92% of homeless mothers have experienced severe physical and/or sexual violence, all of a result of housing not being something guaranteed to everyone. Some other statistics of like people, like women who end up on the streets have shorter lifespans. They age more rapidly and have just overall poorer health and experience more violence when on the streets. So next slide. Thank you. Women are also the fastest growing group of those who are homeless. 38% of all domestic violence victims become homeless at some point in their lives. And with homelessness comes more exposure to violence, like I already said. So, some like historical context of the struggle for housing rights and women's role in that. The organization and militancy of movements in the early to mid 20th century achieved many gains, such as rent control protections, which are now being chipped away. One historical example of that is during the Great Depression and before World War II, there was, in the year of 1933, there was actually a massive amount of rent strikes. One example was in the Bronx from mostly led by communists and Eastern European immigrants. But they staged pickets of apartments that were experiencing evictions, and sorry, lost my place here. But essentially, there was huge rent strikes of thousands of people organized by communists and women's organizations that utilized like child rearing networks that were in place already in order to communicate and like successfully mobilize thousands of people to literally fight against police from stopping people from being evicted, which included like barricading the rooms with furniture and basically doing anything they could. And that went on for about 2 months, like really militantly. And the New York Times was even quoted as saying that women were the most militant among them because they had the most to lose also. So, two other important activists who were communists at the time were Grace Campbell and Williana Burroughs. They organized campaigns against inhumane housing conditions and exploitative landlordism. Campbell and Burroughs pinpointed capitalism as the culprit behind many critical issues in their community, including housing insecurity.
Before I go to the next slide, I just want to say if you like this graphic, it's actually from a magazine that our party produces, and we have some for sale up here. They're $5, but there's some pretty cool graphics in there, if I do say so myself.
Wow, it's the sales bit. So yeah, this is Williana Burroughs and Grace Campbell. That was the info I was looking for. Okay. Through the Harlem Tenants League, Burroughs and her comrades organized and led the working class in rent strikes, demonstrations, and actions to block evictions. They demanded dignified, affordable, and desegregated housing while connecting the denial of such rights to the larger struggle against capitalist oppression worldwide. This dedication to the cause of housing rights led to other community groups and churches taking up the struggle alongside the communists. In New York, Campbell dedicated herself to community work. She donated her own salary to aid the founding of the Empire Friendly Shelter, a home for unwed mothers where she worked as a supervisor. And I'll just read quickly about the thing I was talking about before, too. In the Bronx, communist unions and women organizations protest against the evictions on Charlotte Street. there was a street battle of enormous proportions. The size of these protests reflected the movement's unique ability to tap the energies and organizational skills of neighborhood women who used networks developed in child rearing to mobilize the community and exploited the myth of female fragility to neutralize police attacks. The women played a very big part in the rent strikes. 1 Franklin Avenue tenant wrote. When the police went for the men, the women rushed to protect them. While the men were busy looking for work, the women were on the job. On the day of the evictions, we would tell all the men to leave the building, another activist recalled. We knew that the police were rough and would beat them up. It was the women who remained in the apartments in order to resist. We went out onto the fire escapes and spoke through bullhorns to the crowd gathered below. The women were the most militant, noted the New York Times. They constituted the majority of the crowds, the arrestees, and those engaged in physical conflict with the police. So, that's that. What if housing was a right instead of a commodity? Grace Campbell and Liliana Burrows looked to the Soviet Union for a model of how housing could be. The Soviet Union guaranteed housing as a constitutional right. The Soviet government nationalized large dwellings and unoccupied properties, transforming them into affordable housing for the working class. Rent was only 4% as compared to 30%. Liliana Burrows actually sent her children to live in the USSR in order to avoid being brought up under U.S. racism and the insecurity involved in U.S. capitalism. So, another fact of what the USSR did in order to house, there were a lot of people who did not have housing. So the USSR built, streamlined the production of housing to a new scale that even, government officials in the U.S. noted as, impossible under America's system, and were, deeply impressed by it, even though they still hated on Russia, so. Affordable housing and communal living in the Soviet Union offered women the choice of independent living. Women's participation in all aspects of life, such as political, economic, and social activities, exponentially grew as women were no longer tied down by housework or abusive relationships. Socialized housing liberates women from dependence on the spouse, as well as the exploitative landlord. The housing question and women's liberation are linked. Capitalism has no long-term solution for housing insecurity. While capitalism gives short-term fixes to its innate systemic inefficiencies and inequalities, those fixes or reforms only ever happen from large mobilization by working class and poor people. Women have always been at the forefront, organizing, advocating for equality and human rights. It's not only, there's always a message sometimes, this is kind of not necessarily about this, but often things get watered down to be we're all the same because all we want is to be loved, or something like that, where it sort of ignores the material realities that what connects all of us is that we need to eat, drink, and have a roof over our head, and have health care, and contribute to society in a meaningful way. So that's what we need. It's not more reforms. Do you want to add anything? Because this is the last slide, isn't it?
I think you summed it up pretty good.